Wildlife values. What do you value? Why is wildlife important to us and to our society? This is a really important topic that we need to discuss before we get into any details about wildlife management. Why do you suppose that is? Why do we need to know why we value something before we can manage it? Well, I would argue that if we don't stop to think about why we care or why other people might care, we won't be able to affect change. Because if we don't ever identify why it matters, then it just simply won't matter to people. So this is a foundational lesson for our semester, and we'll come back to this time and time again. And I will challenge you a little bit in your assignment this week in really thinking about wildlife values for different people, because it's really important to recognize that a strong value for one person might not be a value at all to another person. Or, in fact, some people may strongly disagree with it even being considered a value. So, if we look at values of wildlife in North America, we can come up with a fairly good list of different types of values. First of all, there's the economic value. Wildlife does bring in money to our states and to our federal government. So, how is that a value, and how do we use that? There's the aesthetic value. Just the joy something brings by seeing it, smelling it, feeling it. Those are your aesthetic values. There's the recreational value, such as participating in an adventure that is centered around wildlife per se, or just natural resources. There's the scientific educational value. What do we learn from it? How can we share that with others? There's the ecological value. We may even call these ecological services or ecosystem services. What is the value of having a particular species of wildlife around to our greater ecosystem? Then there's cultural. And I hate to say this, but perhaps our country is shifting away a little bit from cultural values of resources. Or it might just be that our cultural values themselves are changing. There's societal values. How does wildlife play a role in our society? And then finally, there's the ethical or moral value. Do we have an obligation to wildlife just simply based on our ethics and our morality as humans? Okay, the first one I want to talk about is the economic value. The economic side of things is a little bit easier for us to put our heads around when we're talking about values. So this is bringing in money, usually due to license sales. So we have our federal duck stamps, where if you purchase a migratory bird, if you want to hunt migratory birds, you have to purchase the duck stamp. We learned about that in the history of legislation. That brings in money to the federal government. On the state side of things, we have license sales from hunting and fishing. This background would be, of course, me and my very first big game deer that I took. And I had to pay for a license for that. And so our state brings in a lot of money, and we talked about that already, that is where most of our wildlife gets funded at the state level, is through license sales, but also through the Pittman-Robertson Act, the Dingell-Johnson Act, the two acts that bring in excise tax on sporting goods and ammunition. And then game animals may fund conservation efforts, remembering that right now most of our economic value of wildlife is centered around game animals, but the money gets spent across the board on wildlife conservation activities. So that's really something to think about, because if we lose the value of hunting, if we lose that economic value, how will we fund other wildlife management projects in the future? Something to keep in mind. The other side of economic is that nonprofit organizations spend a lot of money and fund a lot of conservation efforts for multiple species. And they usually do that through fundraising events and activities rather than through sales necessarily, but they do spend a lot of money on wildlife management. Then there's the aesthetic side of things. Maybe it's bird watching. Maybe it's enjoying just being out and listening to the creek or the birds singing or the wind in the trees. We enjoy watching wildlife in our society, and that's a value, whether or not we spend money on it. Many of us enjoy taking pictures of nature, and that's what we enjoy the most about wildlife. The aesthetic side is the feel-good piece. It's how does it make us feel? And remember, it's more than just looks. It can be the way something smells, the way something feels, the way something looks. And it can stretch from just simply backyard birds, like these little songbirds in my backyard, or to megafauna. Megafauna being our large, charismatic wildlife, like maybe bears. Many people travel to Yellowstone National Park each year and other national parks just to view megafauna like wolves and bears. That ties right into the recreational, and sometimes these values kind of mix a little bit, right? We spend money on it, or the value of seeing a bear drives us to a recreational activity. Maybe it's a safari in Africa, like this picture would include. So, or it might be more local, like driving up to Estes Park in the fall to see the elk or hear the elk bugle. And we have a lot of tourism centered around that. I mentioned Yellowstone National Park and African safaris. These are these recreational opportunities that are driven by people wanting to see wildlife or somehow interact with wildlife. There's the scientific education piece. In this picture, we're taking a wildlife camera that we've set up at Horsetooth Mountain Park and happened to catch a black bear on it. So do we value being able to teach our future generations about wildlife? I do, obviously, and I think many people do value wildlife for its role that it plays in educating our future generation. What about the scientific piece of can we get medicinal products from wildlife or its parts? Maybe we don't even know what the value is on some of these wildlife species for the future of medicine. Sometimes students can relate better to different educational topics if they're using wildlife as an example. Or think about all of our storybooks as children that are centered around wildlife. Wildlife plays a big role in our education, even if we're not realizing that it does at the time. Then there's the ecological piece. What value is there in pollinators? What value is there in prairie dog towns? What value is there in mice and rodents that are feeding everybody? So this ecological piece is looking more at the big picture rather than the individual, looking at the pollinators and the food webs and how they contribute to the overall ecosystem health. And that's something that we'll get into more as we dive into this semester. The cultural piece, like I said, maybe we've shifted away from it, maybe we haven't. Native Americans certainly held wildlife in high regard for their cultural practices centered around wildlife, and that was a very important part of their culture. Early Americans' lifestyles centered around wildlife, from trapping and exploring, using wildlife as food. In fact, most of our early settlers relied entirely on wildlife at some point in order to provide the food that they needed. But what about you and your family? I would argue that for my family, being able to view wildlife is an important part of our culture as a family. Driving up the Poudre Canyon and seeing elk or sheep near the road would be something that hopefully will be an experience that my kids will remember for a long time and is part of their upbringing and importance in our family. Then there's the society piece. How many vacations are centered around wildlife? How many festivals and art shows do we have centered around wildlife? And the ethical and moral piece, and Aldo Leopold hit this really well when he wrote The Land Ethic. And do we have a moral obligation to protect wildlife because we are, the higher intellectual species on this earth? His theory was that we should save all the parts because we don't know what they might do for us in the future. And we should save all the parts simply because we have the power to do so. That we should be caring for our land because future generations will need us to. How well are we doing that? And is this something that our society values? I'd say that's something we should maybe focus on. So out of all of these, which three do you think drive wildlife management in the U.S. the most? I would say that the first is economic. Of course, economics drives so many of our decisions in the United States. The second would be aesthetic. We put a lot of value on how we feel. I would also argue that we are privileged to be able to have the aesthetic value in our top three values of wildlife management, because we have more money and we have more abilities and things available to us than people in other countries. And then the third one would be the recreational piece. Also a privilege, I think, of living where we live. So these three, economic, aesthetic, and recreational, are probably our three most important when we look at what's driving our decisions in the United States. Are there negative values associated with wildlife? Of course there are. When we talk about values, it's not just the positives, there's also negatives. We have agricultural conflict with wildlife for many species that we must mitigate because people's livelihoods depend upon them. We have vehicle collisions with wildlife. If you grew up out east, you've probably hit a white-tailed deer at some point or know someone who has. So we do have a lot of problems and negative economic loss due to wildlife collisions. And disease transmission. Think of avian influenza, the bird flu. Think of malaria transferred from mosquitoes. Think of the plague transferred by fleas from rodents to other animals. So disease transmission, vehicle collisions, agricultural conflict, these are just a few negative values that we can associate with wildlife, and there's probably quite a few more. So why does any of this matter for wildlife management? That's a question I want you to think about, and we can discuss more in class. But why does this matter? Should all of these values be a part of the decision-making process? Or should only the top three, or maybe the top one, or maybe only what matters to us? These are things you need to think about. And are these values universal in all countries, or is North America or the United States unique? That's important to recognize, because as we look at how we manage wildlife in the United States, we need to realize that that might be an incorrect way of managing it in another country simply because the values might be different. It might not be effective across the board. Okay, this kind of wraps up our discussion on values. This will drive our decision making as we move forward in thinking about how to correctly manage wildlife. We always need to be thinking about why it matters, which ties right back to values. So keep these on the forefront of your mind as we move forward in our discussions.